Hi, we continue today in Luke 10 as we follow Jesus telling the story of the victim on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho who's ignored by a priest and a Levite but tended to by a Samaritan. Last video, I provided a substantial amount of information on who priests were and Levites as part of going through the characters and characteristics of people in this story. And so as we've been going through, earlier we looked at these characters, and last time we looked at the priest and the Levite and something about the Samaritans. But in providing all that information, I don't think I really provided a connection with why Luke is providing a priest and a Levite as an alternative to the Samaritan in the story intended to teach the lawyer who questions Jesus something about what it means to be neighbor. Last time I noted that the traditional reading that the priests and the Levites represent a legalistic perspective on Judaism, and then scholars sometimes balance out a bunch of elements of the Torah to say why the priest or the Levite found it acceptable to not take care of the person while they were trying to obey the law. That whole line of thinking has been shown to be based in mostly Germanic historical anti-Semitism among historical critical scholars who saw Christianity as a universal religion replacing the narrow-minded and legalistic religion of the Jews. And that view that Judaism is legalistic, or the Pharisees in particular were legalistic, has been abandoned by all serious scholars over the last half a century as really nothing more than an anti-Semitic projection upon Jesus' opponents. So if that's not the issue, what is the issue? If Luke's not seeing the priest and the Levite as legalists, which is not portrayed here or anywhere else in Luke or Acts, then what is it? And I'd like to suggest that we go back to the chart I showed last time of priests and in Luke Acts. There's a real split between those we see at the beginning, the priest named Zechariah, the humble folks that are there in the temple, and the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, which comes back in Acts at the end, and of course the very people who dispatched Jesus to the Romans via crucifixion. It's quite plain from the very beginning, especially from chapter 3 on, that the official leaders of Jerusalem and of Rome have no interest in Jesus and his way, and that Annas and Caiaphas are aligned with Rome, as is Herod. And so there's certainly no hope that those people would come around and follow Jesus. But what about ordinary priests? Ordinary priests on the ground, like someone like a Zechariah, or the priest that the lepers are told to show themselves to in two places, or this one on the road, are almost certainly just ordinary people, in the sense that there's not particular high status for being a priest, any more than there probably is today in the world where very few people are church-going Catholics or Episcopalians who have priests. Maybe 50 years ago or 100 years ago, people deferred to priests and called them father, etc. But nowadays, Christianity is not in great repute among non-Christians, and maybe priests don't quite have the status in the general public that they might have had. But certainly in the Greco-Roman world, Roman priests, which we haven't looked at here, which is a whole separate story, were often members of the elite who got a priesthood to a particular divinity as an honor. But that's not the case in Jerusalem with these priests. These are just ordinary people. And as I showed also last time, the phrase priests, Levites, and the people is often an expression in late texts like 1st and 2nd Chronicles or Ezra and Nehemiah for the whole of the people of Yahweh. And so perhaps what's being suggested here, although we can't say for sure since there's very little evidence in the text here, is that the priest and the Levite represent Luke's presenting through the mouth of Jesus the last chance that religious leadership might actually show compassion. Not the issue that they would break off with being legalistic and get baptized and become Christians. There's nothing about that in this passage. But when they saw a victim, they would express compassion, as God does and as Jesus does. So part of what's being exposed here is at least these representatives of religious leadership have no compassion on victims. They don't even come close enough to see if the person is a member of their, quote, neighbor group, according to the terms that we looked at last time around neighbors, and we looked at 3 terms. And the one used here, which one acted as neighbor, or the question that the lawyer asks him of who is my neighbor, implies members of a particular community, whether you think of that as ethnic or religious or national, various labels like. In other words, the people of Yahweh. And the question would be then whether the person was circumcised or not, although many people were circumcised who were not Israelites. But the point of the story is that neither the priest or the Levite come close at all. They saw him, they pass on the other side. So there's no sense that they came close to see, is this one of our people? If it's one of our people, I'll take care of him. And if not, he's not a neighbor and I don't care about him. They just simply have no compassion on the victim before they even know who it is. And so that takes us to the Samaritan that we looked at last time, who was moved not with pity in the terrible translation here of the New Revised Standard, but with compassion, as we saw earlier that Jesus is, and that God in the form of the Father of the prodigal son story is as well. And so this ordinary Samaritan, representing an Israelite, not a hated enemy as we saw last time, but an ordinary faithful Israelite, finds himself moved to compassion. One thing we didn't note last time is what is he doing on this road from Jerusalem to Jericho? We saw earlier in chapter 9, and I mentioned a little bit last time, that a Samaritan village, when Jesus began his journey toward Jerusalem in 951, the first thing he experienced was a Samaritan village refused to provide hospitality because Jesus' face was set for Jerusalem. And of course, as we've seen, the Samaritan place of worship was Mount Gerizim, although the temple that he had built there had been destroyed in the 2nd century BCE by John Hyrcanus, a representative of the Hasmoneans who ruled over Jerusalem for about 100 years. So they had no temple there, but they still worshipped on Mount Gerizim and not in Jerusalem, a long historical struggle that we looked at a little bit last time and I won't go into now. But therefore, what is he doing on this road? And a number of scholars have described that what we see in verse 34 and 35 suggests that he was a merchant, that he has an animal, he has wine, he has oil, and he has cash, he has denarii. So that would suggest he'd be a merchant, and a number of scholars have noted that the town of Jericho was a place where many Samaritans lived, and so he could well not be worshiping Yahweh in Jerusalem, although he might have been, we don't know, but carrying his wares from Jericho to Jerusalem and back. Because as we'll see, he says on the next day that he'll return. So he's planning to return, and it doesn't connect it with a festival or anything. So we don't know that, but it's suggesting that he's a merchant. And ironically, that might make him look worse in the eyes of Luke's audience than that he's a Samaritan, because merchants were often looked down upon as people who provided no actual value to the society. This is not a capitalist world where merchants and wholesalers and various people who handle logistics between creators and ultimate purchasers are understood as providing a lubricant for the system. But if you weren't creating something yourself, either through land or your own craft or wine, etc., then you were just profiting off the labor of others, and that was often frowned upon. And when in the series I did in Revelation, we saw how it was the merchants of all the wares that were imported from other places and brought to Rome and Asia that lamented the loss of the cargo in the fall of Babylon in Revelation 18. So for Luke's audience, it well may be that the Samaritan implication that he's a merchant here is what would lead them to go, oh gosh, he's helped by a merchant. But nobody mentions that, so we can't say that for sure. So as we continue to look at our story, we've been looking at the two halves of it. And I was noting last time that the description we saw of the person beaten and the three people to come is not exactly parallel to the first half, but this part certainly is. The answer that the lawyer gave, quoting the Shema and Leviticus 19:8, you shall love the Lord your God and your neighbor as yourself, is being expressed in this passage. And interestingly, love is not mentioned here. It's compassion that's looked at. And I think in fairness, we can suggest that Luke is suggesting that agape and compassion are, if not the exact same thing, or at least in the same universe there. So let's look more closely at what happens here. And as we do, we're looking also at the huge amount of rare words starting in verse 34 in this section. Nearly every word that's not just a small word that connects things is either unique here or very rare. And there are a couple of other words that are only 2 or 3 times that I didn't list here because I'd have to list every one of them. We'll look at those more as we go. So Luke is bringing us into an area of language and of scene that's not really seen anywhere else in the New Testament. And that's another reason why we need to look at this very closely. And one of the things we're going to use, as we saw last time, we looked at the work of Matt Chalmers, who helped us to understand that Samaritans were not seen as the hated other, but were a faction of Israelites. And now from these two authors, Ernest Van Eck, whose picture you can see there, I don't have a picture for his writing partner here, Robert Van Niekerk, but they revisit the question of the two words that are used in Luke for inns, and challenging the presupposition that many scholars simply repeat that inns where there's money charged are in disrepute, and that anybody going there and the innkeeper themselves would be in a bad repute. So let's begin to see what the Samaritan actually does so we can see how this is Jesus' expression of what loving your neighbor looks like. And as we do, we're looking at all these rare key words, and there are even more in here that I'll note that aren't quite as rare as these, but really highlighting that Luke is in making up this story completely out of his own language here, and not even out of language that's used very often outside the New Testament in Greek literature. So he went to him. We already noticed the difference between the priest and the Levite, who we were told saw and then passed on the other side. So as I was noting in the question of what their motivation might have been, they did not come close enough to see whether this person might have been an Israelite by circumcision or anything about him. As the Samaritan indicates here, or at least as Jesus indicates about the Samaritan here, having seen him, he has to come closer to know what's going on. So we went to him and did a whole series of things that express compassion. And almost every one of these descriptions are a unique word or almost unique word. So we bandage his wounds, and that's again a rare word there, unique in the New Testament. His wounds is trauma here, and certainly that's a fitting usage even in the modern English meaning of trauma, as an experience that causes you injury physically or otherwise, but that stays with you. And so these wounds of having been attacked on the road, who knows if we can imagine that person would be afraid to go back to Jerusalem ever again and feel alienated from God because of the surprise attack that left him half dead. We never hear anything about him, but certainly trauma is an apt description here. And so having bandaged his wounds, he does several things. He pours oil, and it's a unique word for oil here with cultic overtones. And oil, of course, is a familiar thing being carried by many people, but oil and wine, along with his own animal and along with the denarii, are support for the interpretation that this person was a merchant. There's no particular reason to think he would have had to carry all these things along with him if he was simply a pilgrim. But of course, a pilgrim might have their own personal wine and oil as well. So we don't know that for sure, but it's certainly supportive of that interpretation. Then he put him on his own animal, as many artistic images show of him lifting him up there. And that would be no small feat for him to lift what is apparently an adult man up onto his donkey. Although it's not described as a donkey, it's simply described generically as a ketenos, generic, his own animal, again with a rare word. And as Bailey notes below, the phrase most likely indicates that he had other animals, perhaps with merchandise. Although the note further down below suggests that the explicit designation for a domesticated animal, sometimes even a pet. In other words, the creature the Samaritan uses to transport the injured person is one that is in synchronic harmony with the human household, that from Tannehill, although lexicon might suggest otherwise. But it's a rare word, so hard to know. So he put him on his animal, and he brought him to an inn. And the word for inn here is pandokion, and the other word translated inn, or something like that in Luke, is kataluma. And that's where we need to take advantage of Van Eck and Van Niekerk's work, which I've tried to summarize in this document here. So as I note to summarize the issue here, older scholarship distinguished a kataluma as a non-commercial inn based on the obligation of hospitality, and a pandokion as a commercial inn, and thus low class because of taking money for something that should be a gift. But as these authors highlight, there's simply no evidence to support that, and they go through it in detail, and I'm just going to try to summarize their conclusions here. So going through a whole series of Roman Egyptian papyri from this over 3-century period, they note a range of meanings that the word kataluma can have, as lodging as hospitality, lodging provided for free, lodging paid for, a dwelling or house, a room or quarter in a dwelling or house, or a stable for animals. And of course, that's similar to what we hear in Luke 2:7, but Jesus is not in the inn, he's in the stable, which is something else. In the Septuagint, it's used 14 times, and I'll just focus on the bold parts where the New RSV translates them in a range of ways that highlight the semantic range of the word kataluma. On a place where they spent the night, at God's holy abode, a woman to her own quarters, a lion described here as his covert, but his den, a place for pasturing sheep, and a lodging place, which is the one that fits what we expect it to mean here. In Luke, though, kataluma is not what's used here. It's used for the place where Jesus isn't put when he's born, because there's no room for him in the kataluma. And then in chapter 22, when Jesus tells his disciples to prepare a place, it's described as a guest room, and that's kataluma as well. And guest room fits one of the definitions we saw up here, but whether that's paid for or not isn't described there. The other word, panadokion, which is the one used here, which is only here in the New Testament, is also rare in Roman texts, but used neutrally or positively to refer to inns and innkeepers. But as we note here, among elite writers, Josephus, the Jewish writer, Plato, the Greek writer, and Strabo, the Roman writer, all use it negatively, Strabo equating with brothels. And one thing we have to ask there is this an accurate description, or is this a prejudice of the elite of places they would never be seen in a culture where the patronage system and honor shame really keeps track track of where people are seen or what their attitudes are toward people that are not like them. And as we saw last time with the description of the Samaritans from 2 Kings 17, which is a Jerusalem-centered perspective and therefore not a factual one about the relationship between Samaritans and Jerusalem, but a polemical one from people who think Jerusalem is the only proper place to worship Yahweh. Similarly, these writers, whether Jewish, Greek, or Roman, almost certainly have no experience with the kind of places that we see in our story here. So Van Eck and Van Niekerk conclude this: we do not have enough evidence to make a clear-cut distinction between non-commercial inns, Cataluma, based on the obligation of hospitality, and commercial inns, Pandokion, based on payment of services rendered. And they also conclude these texts do not only confirm that Jews frequented inns, but also show no evidence of inns being dangerous places or that scrupulous Jews should have been frequented inns. And so as we get to verse 34 and 35, we should have no reason to be suspicious of the innkeeper or that a Jewish audience, the characters in the story, like the disciples rather than Luke's audience, would find something suspicious about going to an inn. And they conclude with the various options that people had for traveling. And this is important in relation to what the Samaritan's choice is. If you were a government worker working for Rome, you stayed in facilities maintained by the cursus publicus, which is like the public works project that would provide spaces for you. If you were well-to-do, you either had a home of your own elsewhere, or you stayed with friends who had their own homes, as people often do when you're traveling. Those with less money could pack a tent and seek a pandokion, as something similar to here. In Latin, some of those are deemed hospitum, a place of hospitality, or diversocium, a place for turning aside, with no particular distinction of whether those are positive or negative. And the lower class stayed in kupana, catering to slaves, sailors, and carters, which is to say like a tavern with rooms above. And that would certainly be a place that the elite, like these people, would never find them in, but that's also not what we're seeing in our passage here. So with that in mind, let's look and see what the Samaritan does in relation to the inn and the innkeeper as we follow the story of what compassion looks like. So after he brought him his own animal, brought him to the inn, and took care of him, again using a rare word, but a word that he says out loud in the story to the innkeeper in the next verse. So, having brought him to the inn and telling the innkeeper to take care of him, we don't hear anything about the innkeeper. And now he spent the night, and so the next day he gives further instructions. Having gotten the person safely to the inn, he took out 2 denarii. A denarius was roughly the equivalent of a day's wage for a day worker. And so 2 of these would be the equivalent of 2 days' wage. The fact that he can give that away is also a suggestion that he might be a merchant. Here's a picture of the coin that from roughly the time of Luke with the Emperor Vespasian on it. And later in Luke, we'll see denarius comes up as a question of Caesar's image on it. There's Caesar's image, and whether it's lawful to pay taxes using that coin. But that's not the issue here. This is the coin of the realm, and worship is not the issue. Taking care with compassion is the issue. So he takes out 2 denarii and gives them to the innkeeper, pandokai, again, a unique word, a variation on pandokion, and said, take care of him, and when I come back, highlighting that he's planning to return, whether that's as a merchant or a worshiper, either way, he's planning to come back, I'll repay you whatever more you spend. The word for repay is a variation on the word give here, but what more you spend is also a unique word in the New Testament and is like a blank check. So he's basically giving the innkeeper a blank check to say, spend as much as you want. And if innkeepers were in disrepute and untrustworthy, that led many scholars to think what a stupid thing to do. The innkeeper could take complete advantage of him. But as I was trying to point out from Van Eck and Van Niekerk, there's no reason to be suspicious of these innkeepers as taking advantage of the person, although we hear nothing about the character of the innkeeper in the story. So that's the story, and then it turns to the conclusion, as Jesus turns to the lawyer and turns the question around. The lawyer's question at the beginning was, who is my neighbor? But Jesus' question is, what does it look like to act as a neighbor? And it's really a turnaround on the question. The question originally was, how wide is the scope of obligation to people I would consider my neighbor? And as we saw last time, the word here in Greek, plesion, means a member of your group. Whether that's Jews or Judeans or Israelites, that's part of the question he's asking. But Jesus turns it around, not on a boundary question, but on a compassion question. And he frames it very precisely. Which one of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? Notice he doesn't say the man left half dead, the man who was beaten, the man who was stripped, but highlighting the man who fell into the hand of the laysdays. And that's certainly an element by which we might recognize we could also turn the story around and read this as a Samaritan taking care of Jesus, as some scholars have done, that a person who's around laysdays, who's stripped naked, who's left half dead, would certainly be similar to the Jesus we see on the cross. And so the story could also be read the other way around, that Jesus is the person on the ground and who will act like a neighbor to Jesus. But it doesn't have to be read that way, but it certainly has room to be read that way. And so the response of the lawyer here, unwilling to say the word Samaritan, simply says the one here, as Fitzmyer noted years ago, studiously avoiding saying the Samaritan, showed him mercy. And he translates compassion into mercy. And those are similar words. They're not identical. Certainly Yahweh is described as merciful and calls people to be merciful. But compassion, I would suggest, is something more. And he's going part way. He's really not getting the guts churned that the Greek word for compassion is suggesting. Here it's suggesting something perhaps gracious, but not something that churns you from the inside. So he's really not quite still getting it, although he acknowledges the right answer. And Jesus says to him with a wonderful irony, go and do likewise. And the irony is that in the story, we were told that the priest saw him and passed on the other side, and the Levite likewise saw him and passed on the other side. So Jesus is saying, don't be likewise like the Levite who either saw or at least acted like the priest, but do likewise like the Samaritan. But we hear no response, and so we don't know what the lawyer has to say in response to Jesus' story here. And interestingly, Luke will follow the story that is a part of a group that we've seen from chapter 9 through chapter 10 about doing, with a story about the challenge of doing without having the right attitude toward your doing. And that's the story of Mary and Martha, and we'll pick that up next time. See you then. Bye-bye.